A man is found in a lonely motel room with no friends or family around. This was not just any man. This was the singer of a band that sold millions of albums and had huge music videos on TV. How does someone go from the top of the world to the very bottom? This happens more than you think in the world of heavy metal, and we have 20 unbelievable stories that prove it. 1. Chuck Schuldiner of Death. This next musician was not just in a band. He pretty much invented a whole style of music called death metal. His name was Chuck Schuldiner, and his band was called Death. Chuck was a total genius on the guitar. He wrote songs that were super complex and powerful, and he inspired thousands of other musicians around the world to pick up a guitar and play heavy, fast music. He was known as the father of a genre. Being a pioneer is one thing, but making a good living from it is another. Death was a very respected band, but they were never as popular as the big stadium rock bands. They were more of an underground sensation. They had dedicated fans, but they were not selling millions and millions of albums. Still, Chuck made a life for himself playing the music he loved, and that was what mattered to him. Then tragedy struck. Chuck got very sick with a serious brain illness. In America, getting sick like that costs a shocking amount of money. He needed a special operation, but the bills were huge. Chuck, the creator of a whole type of music, did not have the health insurance or the savings to cover it. The metal community rallied around him. Other famous bands put on benefit concerts to raise money for his treatment. It was an amazing thing to see, but sadly, it was not enough. Chuck passed away in large part because he could not afford the medical care that could have saved him. Chuck's story shows that even being a genius is not enough to protect you. But our next star faced a different kind of problem. He was the powerful voice of a legendary band, but after he was out of the group, he found himself in a fight for his life after a terrible car crash. 2. David Wayne of Metal Church. Back in the 80s, a new wave of heavy metal was taking over. It was faster and more aggressive, and they called it thrash metal. One of the bands leading the charge was Metal Church, and their singer was a guy with a powerful, screaming voice named David Wayne. He sang on their first 2 albums, which are considered all-time classics by metal fans. His unique voice helped put the band on the map. But like a lot of bands, there were disagreements among the members. David left Metal Church and tried to start other projects. He even started a new band called Reverend. While his new music was good, it never captured the same magic or success that he had with his old band. For years, he kind of drifted through the music scene, playing smaller clubs and trying to make ends meet. It was a tough life, a long way from the big stages he used to command. The final years of his life were marked by struggle. He had ongoing health problems that made it hard for him to work. Then he was in a serious car accident that left him with bad injuries. He needed a lot of medical care, and without a steady income from music, the bills piled up. He ended up living in a small house, in poor health, and with very little money. When he passed away from complications from the car crash, it was a sad end for one of the great voices of 80s metal. David's powerful voice faded away in quiet hardship. But our next story is even more shocking. It is about a singer who was not just poor. His life was tragically taken from him during what seemed to be a simple robbery. 3. Rhett Forrester of Riot. Have you ever heard of a band called Riot? They are one of those bands that true heavy metal fans absolutely love. They have been around forever and have had a bunch of amazing singers. One of the most beloved was a guy named Rhett Forrester. He had that classic rock star look with long blonde hair and a powerful bluesy voice. He sang on some of Riot's best albums in the mid-80s, and he was known for being an incredible performer. After his time in Riot, Rhett worked on a lot of different musical projects. He was a guy who just loved to sing and make music. But the music business can be tough. He never found a project that gave him the same level of success he had with Riot. He was what you would call a working musician, but he was not getting rich from it. Truth be told, he was often struggling to get by. This story takes a very dark turn. Rhett was living in Atlanta, trying to get a new band off the ground. One night, he was the victim of a terrible crime. He was stopped by two people who tried to steal his car. Rhett was a tough guy, and he refused to give it up. In the struggle that followed, his life was tragically taken. It was a senseless and brutal end for a man with such a huge talent. He died with no money, trying to protect the one valuable thing he had left. A violent end for a great voice is a tragedy. But sometimes the end comes not from the outside, but from a person's own inner battles, which is what happened to the bassist of one of the biggest bands to come out of the 90s. 4. Mike Starr of Alice in Chains. The 90s gave us a new sound, a style of heavy rock that came out of Seattle. It was called grunge, and one of the biggest bands in the world was Alice in Chains. Their music was dark, heavy, and full of emotion. The man holding down the bass guitar for their most famous albums was Mike Starr. He was a key part of their sound and their early success, playing on huge hits that are still famous today. Being in a band that big comes with a lot of pressure. The lifestyle can be very intense, with endless touring and parties. Mike struggled with this part of the rock star life. His personal demons got the better of him, and his issues became so serious that he was asked to leave the band right at the peak of their fame. Imagine getting kicked out of one of the biggest bands on the planet. For Mike, it was devastating, and it sent him down a long, dark path. For the next 20 years, Mike was in and out of the news for all the wrong reasons. He had many run-ins with the law and was open about his long battle with his personal habits. He even appeared on a reality TV show about famous people trying to get their lives together. But he just could not seem to escape his problems. He was living in Salt Lake City, far from the rock and roll spotlight, when he passed away. He did not have the fortune that you would expect from a guy who played on multi-million selling albums. He was a man who lost his fame, his band, and in the end, his life. Losing your spot in a huge band is one way to lose it all. But our next star kept his band going until the very end, only to find that the fame he had did not translate into the money he needed to live. 5. Wayne Static of Static X. In the late 90s, a new style of metal called nu metal was all the rage. One of the most unique bands from that time was Static X. They had a crazy, electronic, industrial sound and a frontman who looked like a sci-fi character. That was Wayne Static, famous for his wild hair that stood straight up in the air. He was the leader, the singer, and the creative force behind the band. Static X had several hit albums and were a big part of that music scene. The band had a good run for over a decade, but like all musical trends, the popularity of nu metal started to fade. The band eventually broke up, and Wayne decided to continue as a solo artist. He kept the spirit of his old band alive and toured constantly, playing for his dedicated fans. But touring in a van or a small bus and playing in clubs is a world away from the big arenas he used to play. It is a hard way to make a living. Believe it or not, Wayne had a lot of financial problems. He poured his own money into his tours and his music. He sold off many of his old possessions to keep his career going. At the end of his life, he and his wife were living a very simple life on their tour bus. There were no mansions or fancy cars. When he passed away in his sleep from an accidental mixture of substances, it shocked the music world. He was a man who gave everything for his art, so much so that he was left with almost nothing in the end. Wayne kept the music alive but lost the fortune. The next story is about a modern metal hero, a young man who was on the verge of becoming a massive star before his life was cut short, leaving behind a legacy of music, but not a legacy of wealth. 6. Riley Gale of Power Trip. Sometimes a band comes along that just has that special something. They are exciting, fresh, and everyone seems to love them. In the 2010s, that band was Power Trip. They played a style of music that mixed old-school thrash metal with hardcore punk, and they were amazing at it. The man leading the charge was their singer, Riley Gale. He was an intense and passionate performer who wrote smart lyrics about problems in the world. Power Trip was on the way up, and they were rising fast. Every album they put out got better reviews than the last. They were touring with huge bands and winning over massive crowds. Everyone in the metal world agreed that Power Trip was going to be the next big thing. They were working hard, touring nonstop, and living the life of a band on the verge of a major breakthrough. But when you are a band on the way up, you are not usually making a lot of money. Most of the cash the band makes goes right back into paying for the tour bus, the equipment, and the crew. The band members themselves often make very little. This was the world Riley was living in. He was a critically acclaimed star, loved by fans and other musicians, but he was not rich. Then the unthinkable happened. Riley passed away unexpectedly from health complications related to his lifestyle. He was young and had a future that looked incredibly bright. His passing left a huge hole in the metal community, a sad reminder that a band can be on top of the world in spirit but still be struggling to get by in reality. Riley was a star on the rise, taken too soon. The next story is about a man who played drums for one of the loudest, most over-the-top metal bands ever, a band that preached about glory and honor, but his own final chapter was far from glorious. 7. Scott Columbus of Manowar. Manowar is a band that is all about being bigger than life. They call themselves the Kings of Metal. Their songs are about battles, warriors, and Viking gods. They are known for being one of the loudest bands in the world. For many years, the man pounding the drums behind them was Scott Columbus. He played on some of their most famous albums, providing the thunderous beat for their heavy metal anthems. He even had a special drum kit made of stainless steel because he played so hard he would break normal kits. Scott was a core member of the band during their most successful period. You would think that being the drummer for the self-proclaimed Kings of Metal would mean you were set for life. But the business side of music can be complicated. Scott left the band for a few years and then came back. Then, in 2008, he left the band for good. The reasons were not totally clear, but it seemed like there were some business disagreements. After leaving Manowar, Scott's life became much quieter. He worked regular jobs and played with a local band. Truth be told, he was not living a life of luxury. There were reports that he was having a hard time financially. It was a big change from touring the world with one of metal's most famous bands. Then, in 2011, he passed away. The exact cause was not made public for a long time, but his passing was sudden and shocked his fans. It was a quiet end for a man known for making a very loud noise. The drummer for the Kings of Metal had a quiet and humble end. Our next musician was a rock and roll wild man, a legend from a famous band who lived a fast life that eventually left him with nothing but his reputation. 8. Pete Way of UFO. In the world of classic rock and heavy metal, some guys are just legends. Pete Way was one of those guys. He was the bassist for the British band UFO, and he was the definition of a rock star. He was famous for his wild stage moves, his iconic fashion sense, and for living the rock and roll lifestyle to the absolute fullest. He was a huge influence on many other famous musicians, like Steve Harris from Iron Maiden. UFO had a string of hit albums in the 70s and were a huge concert draw. Pete was right there in the middle of it all, writing songs and performing with incredible energy. But his life was also one of chaos. He had a very public and very long battle with his personal demons, especially with alcohol and other substances. This lifestyle caused a lot of problems, both for his health and his wallet. He made a lot of money, but he also spent a lot of money. Over the years, he was in and out of UFO and played with many other bands, including Ozzy Osbourne's. But he could never quite escape his personal struggles. He had serious health problems later in life, including cancer. He sold off many of his famous guitars and other possessions to pay his bills. He was a man who had been at the top of the rock world, but was now living a very simple life. He passed away after suffering life-threatening injuries in an accident at his home, a tragic end for a true rock and roll survivor who had finally run out of luck and money. Pete Way's wild ride ended in tragedy and financial trouble. The next story is about a singer whose band was produced by a super-famous producer, but a terrible accident cut his career short and left him in a heartbreaking state for years. 9. Frank Starr of the Four Horsemen. Sometimes a band seems destined for greatness. In the early 90s, a band called the Four Horsemen had everything going for them. They had a cool, bluesy hard rock sound, like the band AC/DC. They were signed to a major record label, and their first album was produced by the legendary Rick Rubin, a guy who has worked with everyone from Johnny Cash to Slayer. The band was led by their charismatic singer, Frank Starr. They were getting a lot of buzz and looked like they were about to become huge. The band toured hard and lived the wild life you see in movies. But their success did not last long. The band had some internal problems and broke up for a while. Frank tried to keep the music going, but the momentum was lost. He was living in that tough world between being famous and being a regular guy, trying to make ends meet while still chasing the rock and roll dream. Then a terrible tragedy occurred. Frank was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. The accident left him with severe brain injuries, and he slipped into a coma. For years, he remained in that state, needing constant medical care. His friends and family did what they could, but the financial burden was immense. His rock star dreams were replaced by a quiet hospital room. After several years in a coma, he finally passed away. He was a man with a voice of gold whose shot at fame was cut short by a terrible twist of fate that left him and his family with a mountain of debt. Frank Starr's story is one of terrible luck, but our next musician was a pioneer, a guy whose band helped launch the career of one of the biggest metal singers of all time, yet he himself ended his life in quiet obscurity. 10. Paul Samson of Samson. Before he was the singer for the mighty Iron Maiden, Bruce Dickinson was the frontman for another great British heavy metal band. That band was called Samson, and it was led by a talented guitarist and songwriter named Paul Samson. Paul was the heart and soul of the band. In the late 70s and early 80s, Samson was a key part of what was called the new wave of British heavy metal. They were right there alongside bands like Iron Maiden and Saxon. Samson had a loyal following and released several great albums, but they never quite reached the same superstar level as some of their friends. After Bruce Dickinson left to join Iron Maiden and become a global icon, Paul Samson kept the band going with different singers. He was a true believer in his music and refused to give up. He worked tirelessly for decades, releasing albums and touring. But the music industry is a tough business. While his old singer was playing in stadiums, Paul was often playing in small clubs. He was a respected musician, but respect does not always pay the bills. He struggled financially for much of his later life. He kept making music right up until the end. He passed away from cancer, a disease that requires expensive treatment. It was a sad end for a man who was a true pioneer of the genre. He helped create a music scene that made other people rich and famous, while he was largely left behind. Paul Samson gave a future legend his start, but did not share in the fortune. The next story is about a mysterious figure who created some of the darkest and most influential music ever from a cold, faraway country, all while living a life of total secrecy and simplicity. 11. Quorthon of Bathory. In the cold, dark winters of Sweden, a new and extreme form of heavy metal was born. It was called black metal, and one of its founding fathers was a mysterious musician who went by the name Quorthon. His band was Bathory. Quorthon did everything himself. He wrote the music, played all the instruments, and sang the songs. He never played live shows, and he rarely did interviews. He was a complete enigma. Bathory's early albums are some of the most important in the history of extreme metal. They were raw, chaotic, and scary. They inspired an entire generation of bands all over the world. Later in his career, he shifted his style and created another new genre called Viking metal, with epic songs about Norse mythology. He was a true musical genius and an innovator, but because he was so private and never toured, he never made the kind of money a musician of his importance should have. He lived a very simple and quiet life in Stockholm, away from the spotlight. He released his music on his own small record label. He had a cult following of very dedicated fans, but he was not a household name. He preferred it that way. He passed away from heart failure at a young age, all alone in his apartment. He left behind one of the most important legacies in all of metal, but he died as he lived, in private and without any of the riches his music deserved. From the shadows of Sweden, Kvorthon changed music forever. Our next two stories come from the same country and the same dark music scene, and they are about two bandmates whose shocking actions defined a genre but whose lives were short and certainly not rich. 12th Dead of Mayhem. The story of the band Mayhem is one of the wildest and darkest in all of music history. They took the black metal sound that Bathory started and added a layer of shocking and scary imagery. Their lead singer for a time was a young man from Sweden who called himself Dead. His real name was Per Yngve Olin, and he was completely obsessed with death and darkness. He was known for his extreme behavior on stage and his spooky, ghost-like appearance. Dead was one of the most memorable frontmen in the history of this dark music. He gave the band a dangerous and unpredictable edge, but he was also a very troubled young man. He was living in a run-down house in the woods outside of Oslo, Norway, with his bandmates. They had no money, no heating, and very little food. They were completely dedicated to their music, but they were living in extreme poverty. This poverty and the darkness that surrounded the band took a heavy toll on Dead. He struggled deeply with his own inner demons and his view of the world. His life came to a tragic and disturbing end when he decided he could not continue and took his own life in that cold, desolate house. He was just a young man who created an unforgettable legacy in music, but he lived and passed away in a state of grim poverty that matched the bleakness of his band's sound. Dead's story is a dark one, but the story of his bandmate and the band's leader is just as intense, a tale of a musical visionary who met a violent end before he could see his creation take over the world. 13. Euronymous of Mayhem. The mastermind behind the band Mayhem was the guitarist, a man named Øystein Arseth, who went by the name Euronymous. He was the one who recruited Dead to join the band. He had a vision for what he wanted black metal to be. It was not just music to him, it was a whole philosophy. He started a record label and a record store in Oslo that became the center of the Norwegian black metal scene. Euronymous was a leader and an organizer. He helped many other now famous black metal bands get their start. But this was an underground scene. Nobody was getting rich. In fact, it was the opposite. He was running his entire musical empire on a shoestring budget. The store barely made money, and the bands he signed were not selling a lot of records yet. He was driven by passion for the music, not by a desire for wealth. The story of Mayhem is filled with darkness and controversy, and it all came to a head one night. There was a lot of tension and conflict within the small black metal community. This conflict turned violent, and Euronymous' life was tragically taken by another musician from the scene. He was a young man who had created a powerful and influential movement in music, but he passed away with no money, a victim of the very dark world he helped create. The Mayhem story is one of extreme passion and poverty. But you do not have to be in a controversial band to struggle. Our next star was a celebrated singer for two very respected bands, but even that was not enough to give him a stable life. 14. Worrell Dane of Sanctuary and Nevermore. Worrell Dane was a singer with a voice that could stop you in your tracks. It was high, powerful, and full of emotion. He first became known as the singer for the late 80s metal band Sanctuary. Then, in the 90s, he formed a new band called Nevermore, which became one of the most critically acclaimed metal bands of its time. Their music was complex, technical, and very heavy, and Worrell's amazing voice was always front and center. Nevermore had a huge following of dedicated fans. They toured the world and released albums that are considered modern classics. But here is the thing about being a critic's band. It means that music writers and serious fans love you, but you are not always selling millions of records. Nevermore was always a band that seemed on the edge of a big breakthrough that never quite came. This made it hard for the band members to make a comfortable living. After Nevermore broke up, Worrell continued to make music, both as a solo artist and with a reformed sanctuary. But he had long-term health issues related to a life of hard living, and he struggled with his personal habits. He moved to Brazil to record a new solo album, where the cost of living was cheaper. While he was there, he suffered a heart attack and passed away. He was a beloved and respected vocalist, a true artist's artist, but the financial rewards never matched the level of his talent. Worrell Dane was a singer-singer who never got his financial due. Our next musician was a true journeyman, a guy who played with some of the biggest and coolest names in punk and metal, but who lived the life of a working-class artist right up until his untimely end. 15. Todd Youth of Murphy's Law and Danzig. Some musicians stay in one famous band their whole career. Others are like skilled hired guns, moving between different bands and lending their talents wherever they are needed. Todd Youth was one of the latter. He was a guitarist who was a legend in the New York hardcore punk scene, playing with famous bands like Warzone and Murphy's Law. He was an incredible talent, and his reputation got him some very big gigs. His most famous job was playing guitar for the legendary band Danzig. He also played with a number of other well-known rock acts. He was a guy who seemed to be everywhere, a respected figure who had played on many important albums. He was the definition of a cool, tattooed, rock and roll guitar player. He even started his own band called Fireburn later in his life, showing he still had that creative fire. But being a journeyman musician is a tough road. You get paid for the tours you do and the albums you play on, but when the gig is over, you have to find another one. There is not a lot of stability. Todd was a working musician his whole life. He was not living in a mansion. He was living the life of an artist, which often means struggling to pay the bills. He passed away suddenly at a relatively young age. The news shocked his friends and fans. He was a man who had shared the stage with legends, but who lived and passed away as a humble, working-class hero. Todd Youth was a hero to many, but not a rich man. Our next story is about the leader of a band known for its insane costumes and wild shows, a man who was a brilliant artist, but whose monster suit was worth more than his bank account. 16. Dave Brockie of Gwar. There has never been a band quite like Gwar. They are a group of artists and musicians who dress up like giant, grotesque space monsters. Their live shows are legendary for being incredibly messy and over the top. The leader and visionary behind this insane art project was Dave Brockie, who was better known to fans as his character Odorous You Run Gus, the lead singer of Gwar. For 30 years, Dave led this band of misfits. He was an incredibly creative and funny person. He wrote the band's songs, designed their costumes, and created the whole mythology behind the band's universe. Gwar had a massive cult following and toured the world. To an outsider, it looked like they must be making a ton of money. Their shows were always packed. But the truth is, running a project like Gwar is unbelievably expensive. The monster costumes cost a fortune to make and maintain. The live show requires a huge crew and tons of equipment. After all those expenses were paid, there was not a lot of money left over for the band members themselves. Dave and the others were not getting rich. They were doing it for the love of the art. Dave lived a surprisingly modest life off stage. He passed away at his home from an accidental overdose, a quiet and tragic end for a man who lived such a loud and wonderfully strange life on stage. He was an intergalactic monster to his fans, but in reality, He was a struggling artist. Dave Brockie was a true original who put his art before money. For our final story, we look at the bassist of a hugely successful 80s rock band, a man whose personal battles and bad decisions left him without the fortune his band's success should have provided.